Okay, in this part of the cameras PowerPoint, we're going to talk about different types of shots. We've already talked about the 7 main types of shots, but this is also has to do with how the image is composed in the viewfinder, where objects are in the viewfinder, and the shots, the terminology used to identify those types of shots. First is the center shot, and the idea here is that this is the object is in the middle of the shot, and what you're looking for is a level of symmetry. Symmetry, of course, is that if you took this shot and you folded it in half, it would be almost identical on both sides. So if you split it in half down the middle, it would be mirrored on the right half and the left half, so that the two halves would be almost exactly the same. The center shot is also sometimes called a single shot, simply because you have only one of the object or subjects in the shot. So accordingly, you can have 2 shots, 3 shots, 4 shots, depending how many persons or objects are in that shot. The problem here, of course, is that the higher the number of people or objects in the shot, the more the angle is going to change, simply because that if you have 5 people in a shot, unless you have a really wide angle lens, you're not going to be able to position the camera straight on to look at all 5 of them. And instead, you'll have to move the camera to either the left or the right, so that there's an angle that allows you to include all of the subjects or objects in that shot. An interview shot is a single shot, but it is not a center shot. The idea here is that the interviewee is either a little bit on the left side or a little bit on the right side, and is looking to the opposite side. So if the person is on the right side, they're looking to the left side, and vice versa. The idea here is that the image you want to give is that the person is talking to someone else. There's someone there interviewing that person. When you have an interview shot, very often you may also have a 2 shot of the person being interviewed and the person who is doing the interviewing here. What you need to notice is that if you want to change the angle so that you are showing the interviewer, there's something you have to be aware of, and this is what's known as the line of parallax. In the textbook, it calls it the vector line. I don't like that term because vector is used in other references. So the line of parallax is actually a better term to use. This line of parallax is an imaginary line that runs through the 2 subjects. The camera needs to stay on one side of that line if the camera is being moved. Okay, you don't want to cross that line, because if you do, you get an odd image. If the person being interviewed is on the right side of the image of the frame, and you go across the line of parallax and you show the interviewer, suddenly the interviewer is also on the right side of the frame. So it's important not to cross that line of parallax if you are doing what are known as reverse shots. Always stay on the right side or the same side of that line of parallax. Now we start talking about some terms related to the images within the frame and where they are. And this is important because our eyes tend to go with certain shapes, certain objects, brightnesses of objects within the frame, where objects are, or indicators of where objects are, or again, some objects may be brighter. This is what our eyes tend to look at, tend to get our eyes' attention. These are known as vectors. These are basically lines of direction that our eyes tend to follow within the frame. The first of these are graphic vectors, and these are the strongest lines that grab our eyes' attention and make our eyes move around the frame. If you look at the image on the right here, the first thing you looked at probably was the telephone pole here, because it has a lot of different angles to it, has a lot of different objects on it. It's also the brightest part. It has the big white, the reflection of the sun here. But then your eyes probably grabbed attention of the lines going to the top right, and then your eyes grabbed attention of the lines going from the top right to the bottom left. And really, you're kind of going in a cycle here, and simply because these are the strong lines that grab our eyes, and we just follow them instinctively. Second is what are known as index vectors. These have kind of a minimum or a medium strength in the attention they get from our eyes. As you look at the woman in the picture here, we don't know what she's pointing at, but we know that she's pointing at something. And so this is going to take our attention. And we assume as viewers here that the next thing we are going to see is whatever she's pointing at. If we don't, we tend to think, okay, there's something wrong here. Why aren't we seeing what she's pointing to? Because she is drawing our attention to that object. Then the weaker are the motion vectors, and these are vectors that suggest an object is in motion, and so we assume that it is in motion in that particular direction, and that it will continue to be in motion in that direction until something tells us that it's not. We look at this and we assume it's moving to the bicyclist is moving to the right, but then if something happens, the bicyclist hits something, or the film is reversed and the bicyclist is actually going backwards, then we react to that. But our assumption is that the bicyclist is in motion and that motion is to the right. The principle of thirds is probably the most common principle used in image construction. That is that the purpose here is to create non-symmetry. That is to create a space that directs the viewer's eyes towards a particular object or subject. You can think of the principle of thirds is if you took basically a tic-tac-toe grid, you have spaces in the in the top third, in the bottom third, in the right third, and in the left third. You also have spaces at the intersections of the grids. If you look at pretty much any image out there, this is what you will find. You will find that there is the image, the space has been divided up into a tic-tac-toe thirds, and this is where the object is. In a picture like this, you have a large empty space, but because our eyes need something to look at, something to feed our brain data, we immediately go to, first off, probably the moorings here, simply because they're brighter. But then eventually we're going to go up to the ship that's on the top third here. But again, it's on the bottom third and on the left third. This is where the objects are, because this is what's going to grab our attention from the empty space that is in the upper right. Another term is what's known as headroom. That is how much space is there between the top of the subject's head and the top of the frame. The image on the left, of course, is a proper image, a proper headroom, simply because the person isn't banging his head on the top of the frame, but has enough space so that it looks comfortable. Again, the idea of thirds: the person's head is in the upper third and the person's torso is in the bottom third. Of course, the image on the right looks like we have a disembodied figure here, and that would make that just looks uncomfortable. Another term used with respect to the spacing or the placing of a person, a subject, within the frame is what's known as nose room. In other words, how much space is there between the side of the frame and the front of the person's face. If it is too close, we feel uncomfortable. There's a fear that the person might actually bump his nose on the side of the frame. On the other hand, this is also a technique that's used by directors of slasher films, of the kind of horror thriller films, where there is a lot of empty space behind the person who may be the next victim. And if you've seen enough of these, you start to expect something to appear in that empty space that is not going to be good for the individual who's in that space. So even though we look to see how much space is between the nose and the side of the frame, that empty space behind the person is used a lot nowadays in thriller movies. Lead room has to do, again, sort of with the motion vector. That is that there is an object that is in motion in a particular direction, and how much room does that person or that object have with respect to the side of the frame. Again, going back to the nose room, if the object is close to the frame, we expect that possibly something might come in and fill that empty space behind the object. And again, it might be the beginning of an accident or something else that's going to create a new type of action in this particular scene. There, of course, are problems that you need to be aware of as you are placing particularly subjects in specific spaces within the frame. Of course, with this one, first off, the woman looks as if she's got a sign above her head that just shouldn't be there. There's an imbalance here. But then if you look a little more closely, she has a pole coming out of her head. There are other things that could have maybe a pole that goes through her head. So you have to look at these things and you have to see what's in the background, and does this object in the background create an image that either makes the viewer uncomfortable or might become comical. The last part of this PowerPoint is going to be related to lighting. We'll look at what is the purpose of lighting, and then we'll look at really kind of do a review of three-point lighting, because remember we looked at three-point lighting in the last lab before we no longer met. And then we'll look at shadows. Shadows are just an artifact of lighting. Wherever there's light, there's going to be some degree of shadows. The question is, what do you do with the shadows? So what does light do? Of course, its most obvious purpose is to illuminate the object or the subject that is part of the video or part of any sort of still photograph. With respect to broadcast, with respect to video, with respect to television, lighting is absolutely everything. If you don't have lighting, you don't have TV, you have radio. So light is important. You want to have good quality lighting whenever you are shooting video. But of course, the question is, how can do you want to create a mood with that light? You still have to have the light so that the audience can see the object or the subject. The question is, how much do you want to illuminate that object or subject? With respect to that also is, and again, we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about shadows, use of shadows, what they do. With lighting, you are either eliminating, in other words, the more light you have, the fewer shadows you're going to have, or you are accentuating shadows. So the less light you have, the more shadows you are going to have, but with those shadows, perhaps you are trying to create a particular mood. I always find it fascinating that in programs like CSI or Law and Order, whenever they have something, whenever a scene is done in a scientific lab, they still have this mood shadow lighting. When if you go to any lab in the world, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of light because scientists want to see things as they are working on them. So television has to generate moods. So even in places where in reality there would be lots of light, they still create moody types of visuals by accentuating shadows or manipulating the shadows one way or another. So now let's review what we talked about before in lab, and that is the basics of three-point lighting. Again, three-point lighting is, like it says, three lights, except there is the option for a fourth light. First, the primary light is the key light. Remember, the key light is the primary source of light. This is the brightest light. Where do you position it? The key light always goes in front of and either to the left or the right of the subject. We don't want it directly in front of the subject because the bright light could make the person start to squint, and then that doesn't give us a good picture, a good image. So the key light always goes in front of and either to the left or to the right of the subject. The next light is the backlight, and the backlight goes, again, there are two types of positioning here. First, the backlight, if it's on a stand, should go behind the subject and either to the left or to the right. We don't want it to go directly behind because if you have a light on a stand, that stand could look like it's coming out of the subject's head, and then that is a bad image. So if the light is on a stand, it should go again either to the left or to the right, but from behind the person. If the light is from a grid hanging from above the subject or the object, then it can go directly behind the person. The purpose of the backlight is to add dimension. That is, it's to give the person depth. Again, if you look at the image here, you'll see that there is light from the backlight on the top of the person's head and on the shoulders. Again, what this does is make the person look three-dimensional. It doesn't look like a flat poster, but rather looks three-dimensional. The third light is the fill light. Remember, when you position the key light on either the left or the right, the fill light goes on the opposite side. So if the key light is on the right side, the fill light goes on the left side. Why? Because that key light is going to create shadows. So the fill light, the primary purpose of the fill light is to minimize the shadows that are generated by the key light, and that's why the fill light goes on the opposite side, so that those shadows that are generated by the key light will be diffused. Then the optional fourth light is the background light. Don't get the backlight and the background light confused. The background light is there simply to do what the name says, light the background. You do not have to have a background light because if you're outdoors and you have sunshine, the background is probably already lit. Or there are if you are indoors, a lot of producers like to just have a dark background behind the person. Adds a little drama to it. So the background light only lights the background, and it is an optional light. So three-point lighting is used primarily indoors in controlled environments where, again, you have control over the lighting situation. If you are outside, if you are in a place where you don't have much control over the lighting situation, this is what's known as field lighting. How do you deal with the different sources of light, some natural, some artificial? What you can do is use the sun as the key light, the principal source of illumination, meaning that you would turn the subject towards the sun. Again, hopefully the sun is either on the left or the right of the person so that the subject isn't looking directly into the sun, and then place the camera on either the left or the right of that sun. Again, the potential problem here is that the sun can be very bright, and consequently, if the person is looking even sort of in the sun's direction, it can cause squinting, which again isn't the best image. So how do you deal with that? One solution is to just basically turn the subject so that he or she isn't looking directly into sunlight. The potential problem here, though, is that, again, with a key light on one side, it's going to potentially create shadows on the other side of the person's face. So how can you deal with that? Probably the best way is to use a deflector. Deflectors can be any kind of object that is going to reflect sunlight. A lot of reflectors nowadays you can buy for $25, $30. They're big cloth silver circles that enlarge, and you can fold them up and put them in a pouch. But what you do is you position the camera and the person so that the sun is behind the subject, and then put the reflector in front of the person, and then the reflector reflects the sunlight back into the front of the person, illuminating the subject. And then the sun itself acts as kind of a backlight. thing is, you don't necessarily have to buy a reflector. Any large piece of cardboard that has white on it, or just has something that is going to reflect the light. You can also use buildings. I've done that before. Stand the person next to a building that is reflecting the sun off of a white wall, and you have a natural reflector right there. The next thing to consider is shadows. As I said, shadows are simply a natural phenomenon wherever there is light. They're natural byproducts. It's wherever there's light, shadows are going to be there. The question is, how many shadows are there? Where are they? How are you going to deal with them? Do you want to get rid of them, or do you want to actually use them and create a kind of visual mood within the scene? Shadows are very important in several respects because they have specific functions. One thing they do is define shapes. The object on the left is looks like just a regular triangle, like a flat triangle. But on the right, shadows added here gives the what was a triangle dimension. Now it looks as if it is a cone instead of just a flat triangle. Shadows also add texture. If this was a bigger or a better image, you would see that on the surface of the sphere looks very smooth, where there is lots of light, where there are no shadows. On the other hand, when you add shadows, it suggests that the texture of the sphere is a little more rough, has some grit to it. Shadows are also used to emphasize the specific shape of an object and help define that object. Obviously, this is a truck driver from Erie, Pennsylvania. Shadows also are used for silhouettes, in other words, to hide identities. Of course, if you've seen this movie, you know that this is the killer, but we don't know who the actual killer is. So it's used by filmmakers to add thrill, add some mystery, but it's also used by news people. There may be a whistleblower who wants to talk about something that is particularly important, but doesn't want to be identified. To create a silhouette is very simple. You just put the camera in front of the person, but then put the light behind the person so that the camera can't see who the person is, but instead creates a silhouette. And then you can do an interview with the person in that silhouette. Of course, what shadows are used most often for is to evoke some sort of an emotional response from the audience. Here, of course, the light is below, creating shadows all over the face of the person. If you look at this, ask yourself the question: what makes this face so scary? We know that the face has a mouth. We know that the face has a nose. But what we don't know is, does the face have eyes? So it's really the loss of the eyes that tends to create the fearful image. What theater companies use all the time in set decoration is shadows to suggest a particular location. Very often, theater companies have a limitation on the amount of money they have, and so they can't build expensive sets. Rather, they use shadows to suggest a particular location, a particular place within the context of the play. Here, this shadow might suggest that the action is taking place within a jail, because the lines of the shadows suggest jail bars. On the other hand, if you just move that shadow in a different direction, there might be a suggestion of stairs or a ladder of something of some sort. So that, again, using the shadows in a different way and moving it in so that it looks like it's going in a different direction, you can create a new understanding of a particular place or a particular location. So that's the end of this PowerPoint on cameras and lighting. I wanted to get this out to you so you could listen to it, so you could look at it. Again, the information here will be on the final exam, but I also wanted to get it out to you so that as you are thinking about what you want to do with your video narrative, you can use some of the information on here to go ahead and shoot your videos and position your cameras in a way that will get you the most effective shots, or set up lighting that could be more conducive to what you're trying to accomplish with your video narratives.